We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets.
I have the body of a weak and feeble woman.
All men are created equal. Because I have a dream.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of ModsPod. Today we have a really special guest. We've got Miss Owings all the way from Georgia, the United States of America. Hello, Miss Owings.
Hello.
How are you?
I am really good.
Cool. So, what are you going to talk to us about today?
Being from the States, I wanted to talk a little bit about the civil rights movement in the States, specifically being from the South, so that's a big thing.
Okay, so we learn about, in year 8, the Jim Crow states, the southern states. So I think that'd be quite interesting that you're from one of the Jim Crow states.
Yeah, I am.
So where's that?
I'm from Georgia, which is smack dab in the middle of, like, the deep South. The Bible Belt is what we call it.
Oh, what's that mean?
Very, very religious, very conservative areas.
Nice. So, or not nice, but... so, some people often ask, lots of people ask, particularly when we do Germany, do students in Germany learn about the Holocaust and things, for example? So in the US, although the civil rights movement and the slave trade is probably a dark period of history, do you guys learn about that as students?
We do. So the way we learn about it, we learn a lot about the Civil War. Obviously, that was the first major interstate thing we had going on. We learn about the Civil War, which ended up ending and slaves were freed in about 1865. Then they kind of disappear for a while. We don't really talk about like Black history and what African American people were doing until the 1940s, 50s, 60s, when the big civil rights movement finally kind of came to fruition. But between those points, really, we don't talk about what people were doing at that point.
Right, so in this country, when we do the civil rights movement, we generally pick it up in the 60s, the 50s maybe a little bit earlier, and we look at obviously Martin Luther King and I think in RE as well, students will learn about Malcolm X and things a little bit more. Mm-hmm. So that's quite interesting that there's that gap from when slavery ends to the civil rights movement. So where do you want to start then?
Well, I guess, like I said, slavery ended in the mid-1860s, but the first real semblance of anything having to do with civil rights wasn't until about 30 years later. That was when the first major court case happened. It was called Plessy versus Ferguson. That basically said that there was not going to be actual integration of Black people into society, but there would be separate but equal facilities. So there would be a Black school and a white school, and Black bathrooms and white bathrooms, and that's how they did it across the country. Unfortunately, even though they said it was supposed to be equal, it wasn't equal. And there was a very big gap between the quality of white education and Black education and the facilities and that sort of thing. Until then, or up after that, I should say, that's kind of when it goes quiet. And then we pick back up in the 40s. That's when the first integration of something actually happened. That was the military, was the first major thing to be integrated. And that was by Truman, because obviously there was a war happening. So they needed extra soldiers, and that made a lot of people angry. The only thing that they wanted to integrate at the time was when they needed the help, basically.
Okay, so Black people could sign up to the war to be a soldier?
Yes, and they could before. Obviously, there were Black battalions and stuff in the First World War, but this was integration, so there would be mixed race actual battalions.
Okay, so for some people then, for the diehard racists, even having someone on your battalion would have upset them. They didn't even want to share ranks.
Yes.
With Black people.
Absolutely. The KKK got restarted, actually, a lot earlier. I guess that was the 1910s. But it kind of fell a little bit. And then once that integration started happening again in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, that's when they started picking back up. More hate crime was happening, more targeted attacks of actual Black people in the South.
Oh. So you might think, mightn't you, that because these guys had gone over to Europe to fight in the war, risked their lives, in fact, died with their fellow Americans, that attitudes might have changed after the war?
I would say maybe for some people, but being from the South, it was very much still an issue. I mean, that happened in 1948 was when the military got integrated. And then Emmett Till obviously happened in the 1950s, and there were a bunch of other attacks like the Freedom Riders and Birmingham, which happened in the 60s. So there was still a lot of tension and actual targeted attacks that were happening. I can't really speak for what the North was doing, but historically they've been a lot more understanding
Right.
of like racism and stuff in America.
So you mentioned Emmett Till there. Emmett Till is one of the most tragic stories, I think. We do teach about that in school, of a young boy who allegedly smiled or smirked or winked at a store clerk, and the family came and got Emmett Till later on that night. So you learn about that in school.
Yeah, we see the picture and everything in school. Unfortunately, it's, I guess, for Americans, not as hard-hitting, I think, as it might be for you guys, because especially being from the South, it was so common. He was the really big figurehead of the I guess, fight for civil rights because he was so young and he was innocent, allegedly. But in the South, you would be in a town and historically there would be 10 or 11 lynchings, which is basically what happened to him just in that town. And you would move a town over and there would be more. It was just so common in the South. I think Mississippi, which is one of the most racist states at the time, had like over 500 lynchings of young black people. Obviously, no trial. It was just judge, jury, and executioner in those kind of states.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just go back a little bit then to beginning, because one of the things I always sort of not laugh at, I suppose, but when you think about the power of America and the status of America in the world, that actually America is a baby. So what we're looking at 350 years perhaps.
Yeah, about.
As a history, and you look at Britain, the history goes back to Roman times and beyond, Europe. Mm-hmm. But yet this superpower is just 350 years old. So if we just nip back, not worrying about too much about the revolution for now, perhaps we could do an episode on that one time. But the Civil War, what was the Civil War? Who was fighting who?
So basically there was the North and the South, to put it simply. There were also border states who kind of were trying to stay out of things, but you really can't when there's a war happening in between you. So the northern states were where a lot of the industry was. The southern states had the fertile soil, so that's where all the cotton, tobacco, major crops were being built, or being farmed, I should say. So as more structure was coming into the country, the South was falling behind because they didn't have all the infrastructure that the North had. They didn't have the technology. So that in itself created more tensions. Also, as things started to become more technological, people started to have differing views on the slave trade. Obviously, the transatlantic trade had ended a good few years before slavery in the States did. But people in the South basically thought that the only way that they could be successful was to have slavery so that they could have just the sheer amount of power and workforce. People in the North started disagreeing with that. And the issue is, as we gained more land, people were fighting over what states should allow slavery and shouldn't allow slavery. So there were a lot of compromises happening. Eventually, people didn't want to compromise anymore. And the South decided the best thing to do would be to leave and to secede from the Union, is what they called it. Obviously, the northern states didn't like that because they like having food and cotton and all that fun stuff. So they started fighting back and forth. The South said that it was because they wanted their own personal states' rights and that the federal government shouldn't be interested. But the North basically said that the South needed to end slavery altogether. And so they started fighting. And eventually, President Lincoln, who was president at the time, quote-unquote, punished the South by releasing the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all of the slaves, but only in the states that were fighting against the North. So if you were a slave in states like Maryland, which was a border state, you had to remain a slave. So it was a punishment towards the South for trying to leave.
So am I right in saying that at the time there was only 13 states?
There were a few more than that. We had the 13 original colonies, but at that point, states like Missouri and Kansas had come in. Those were the states people were arguing over because some people thought they should be slave states, some people thought they should be free. Okay. It got bloody. We had something called, I think, Bloody Sunday or Bloody Kansas, something like that, and that was because people actually started physically fighting over that decision.
I suppose for the idea of the slave trade, we know it's horrific, but the value of it, you know, if you take away the human element of it, you can almost you can see why the states didn't want to give it up.
Yeah, exactly.
So who won the Civil War, if there's such a thing as a possibility, say somebody won?
I guess historically it's kind of agreed that the North won. The infrastructure that they had, the railroads, definitely helped. They were basically able to cut the South off from everything until they had to give up, basically, and put up the white flag. So after that, officially slavery was ended. In 1865 is the year it officially ended, and that was also the year that the Civil War officially ended.
Okay, so then you said earlier that there was a bit of a gap in the history of African Americans until, I guess, the next time we see them is when they start being persecuted or fighting back, shall we say. What would you say?
Right, so 40s was the military. The next big thing that happened was education became integrated, or attempted to. That was the 1950s Brown versus Board of Education, which basically said that separate but equal was no longer a thing. So they had to integrate. Obviously, a lot of people in the South did not want that to happen. So there was actually riots specifically against the children that were trying to come into the school. So there were kids like Ruby Bridges who had to be escorted by, I think, the National Guard, which is basically the equivalent of the military. There were also the Little Rock Nine, which was a group of, I think, college students at that point in Arkansas, which is equivalent to y'all's university. They had to be escorted by the federal government because the state government had come in. The governor had said to preserve order, which was basically a euphemism for do not let these black kids get into our white school.
Okay. Wow.
And then, yeah, so pretty heavy stuff. And then even at the college that I went to, there were 2 students that came in 1961 was the year. So, less than 80 years ago, I guess, or a little bit more. But 1961, they came to the school. It was just 2 of them trying to enroll less than 65 years ago, and they had riots. One of the female that attempted, her name was Charlene Hunter. She had bricks thrown into her dorm building, which is still a dorm building that actually is on campus that I've been to. They ended up being pulled out of the school for their own safety, and then federal order that they were able to go back to the school, and they had basically guards with them to make sure that they were not getting attacked by the students that didn't want them there. But they ended up graduating, and then more black students were able to come and enroll after them. But that was in the 60s, and that was 2 students at the largest public university in the state, basically in the South, and they were facing so much backlash. And that was just basically for every student that was starting the integration in these states, it was a very, very dangerous time for them.
So you could say these people were really brave.
They were.
Especially the Little Rock Nine, you mentioned them. We learn about the Little Rock Nine in school. But that's quite an interesting insight, what you've just given there, particularly of the experience of those 2 in your campus.
Yeah.
Wow.
The admissions building is actually named after them. It was, like I said, Charlene Hunter, and then the other one was named Hamilton Holmes. He's passed, I'm pretty sure, but the admissions building is called the Hunter Holmes Admissions Building. So that's, I guess, how we commemorate them, but really that doesn't feel like enough, honestly, for what they were able to, what they had to face just trying to get their education.
Yeah. So you mentioned lynching earlier, the lynchings that happened in the deep South states. What are lynchings and what's that about?
So lynchings, I guess to put it simply, is basically when people think of it, it's the hanging of black individuals, but it really could be anything. They would capture them if they thought they were guilty of anything, even looking at a white person the wrong way. They would torture them, beat them up, and it usually ended with these black individuals being hung in front of hundreds of people.
So
public executions, trying to make, I guess, an example of these people. And never was there an actual jury trial or usually any guilt of anything. So that was very, very common in the South.
So these lynchings then, if say I suppose I've seen photographs and we look at them in our lessons that almost look like people have gone dressed up in their finest clothes to watch this public lynching or execution. And probably quite clear then as we go on to think about the KKK shortly that probably people in the crowd may well certainly will have been in members of the KKK as well, and even the police perhaps sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. It was a spectacle in the South. Sometimes they would actually line people up on what were called hanging trees so that it would be more of a, experience for the people that were watching it. And absolutely the police forces back then had a lot of members of the KKK. The KKK, especially in the South, were basically blended into government positions. Even at one point, the governor of Georgia was an outspoken racist, because it was just normalized back then that was okay, and that the other group was the black people, and what they were fighting for was unnecessary, and they needed to kind of find their place. That was kind of the rhetoric that was going around at the time.
Cool. Wow.
Yeah.
All right, so the civil rights movement then is going to start picking up now. We've had some progress in education, in Brown versus the Board of Education. Mm-hmm. It's difficult, but you said these brave students who went. Was that the only progress, or did it sort of get worse before it got better?
Honestly, it probably got worse, because after the education movement for integration, that's when people really started fighting for just public integration of everything. That's when the sit-ins started happening in the 60s, the Montgomery bus boycotts, when Rosa Parks sat in a space that was quote-unquote not for her. People started saying, basically, if we're allowed to be in the military, if we're allowed to have equal schools, why can't we just be equal at the end of the day? But really, they weren't able to get any say, because there were very few black individuals actually in the government fighting for them. And that was because, at the time, black people didn't even have equal voting rights. There were literacy tests. So in the 1900s, they would have to pass these literacy tests that were engineered to be incredibly hard. After coming from families that were not able to get education because of the separate but equal laws. And then there was also something called the grandfather clause, which basically said, if your grandfather was allowed to vote, then you can vote. For many of these black individuals, their grandfather was a slave, so he wasn't allowed to vote. And they basically said, that's too bad. Maybe next time. That's basically what they were telling these people. So there were very, very few actual black individuals in the government. And when they were not in the government, there was really nobody in the government fighting for them, because the white individuals that were on their side were from states where they knew if they spoke out about it, they would just not get reelected.
Okay, so the literacy test you just mentioned there were obviously impossible to pass.
Absolutely.
If your education is even at best substandard. So they went, they failed the test, and they were told to go. So we know that people from the north did travel down to try and help educate some of these black people in the south, but they found a way to somehow, I guess, stop you. Even if you pass that literacy test, and you guys call it a felony.
Yes.
So in England, we'd say they've got a criminal record, essentially. So these kids, young black kids, maybe teenagers, were given felonies, because then that stops you being able to register to vote. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. If you were a felon, you were not allowed to vote. So they would pick up a kid for stealing a piece of bread or a packet of gum from the local gas station and charge them as like a Class A felony. Whether or not they actually ended up in prison for that, it didn't matter. If that was on their record, they couldn't vote. So they basically were disqualifying them from the age that they could get them to disqualify.
Wow. So just going back a little bit to what we were saying about the lynchings and stuff. One of the things I've always sort of thought, not to justify it, but one of the reasons that I've seen for why people in the Deep South especially said that this was a problem was poverty. So is it fair to say that some of the actions of the members of the KKK or the community who were particularly racist or angry were maybe jealous that maybe some black people had a hog or had something that they didn't, and they felt that that was absurd, that this a black person could have more than them, so they took it from them?
That's, honestly, I don't think I've ever heard that, but it's completely understandable. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, I don't know if you guys teach it here, but there was something called the Tulsa Race Massacre. Tulsa was a thriving black community in the South, and basically the white people, the KKK in the area, were jealous of that, exactly like you said, and they went in and they just killed people in that community because of that envy, because of that jealousy over success. Even if they weren't able, if those white people were able to have the jobs and the success that they saw reflected in that black community, it was just the fact that that community was black that made them angry. So that entire community was practically decimated just because of the fact that they were black and successful, and white people thought that should be mutually exclusive, the racist white people in the South.
Was that in the 50s?
I believe so, yeah.
All right, so the 50s then, we're going to start seeing some more, I suppose, international examples of fighting back. Mm-hmm. You mentioned Rosa Parks, mm-hmm. And then obviously into the 60s. So what's happened? There's a play, obviously, for us, probably the most famous scene, or what we've seen, is at Montgomery, with the bus boycotts, but also in Birmingham, Alabama, mm-hmm. where the police set the dogs onto the black people. pregnant black people. So what was that about? Why did that happen?
Honestly, the police brutality was one of the only ways that they could quell what they saw as a rebellion. A lot of black people and a lot of civil rights activists at the time were fighting peacefully. They were protesting peacefully. The bus boycotts very rarely got violent. The marches, they marched obviously to Washington. There was a march in Selma, which I also believe is in Alabama. So the fact that they were not protesting violently basically made the cops believe that they had to almost stir up the violence that they were placing onto the black people.
Right. So Selma, I think Selma is an example of where there was a bus of black people going to a protest, and on a bridge they were stopped.
Yes.
And I think the bus was set on fire, and there was an attack there. So thinking about this sort of peaceful protesting that you're talking about is Martin Luther King's thing, isn't it? So peaceful protest, in order to not be accused of being violent, and everything that essentially what they're going to say, they're uncivilized black people, they're not like us white people, so look at the way they behave. So it was really important for these people protesting that it remained peaceful, so they couldn't throw that one at them.
Yeah, and obviously there were different camps of people. A very large group of activists did believe that they needed to be violent in order to enact the change, which you see in almost every activism movement, even like the suffragettes that we were just talking about. There's the different groups. Yeah. But the very big one was the people that followed Martin Luther King, who were attempting to be nonviolent. And yeah, the buses, they were specifically called the Freedom Riders, and they would be targeted, blown up, set on fire. People would be dragged out of them. They were basically, I don't want to say small scale because it wasn't, but small scale terrorist attacks happening to the people that were brave enough to be on these buses from the KKK would specifically target them and end those buses is what they basically were trying to do. Wow.
So all that's going on, buses getting bombed, dogs being set on women and people, churches getting blown up. All these things are going on, and yet Martin Luther King is still saying remain peaceful. That must have been hard to remain peaceful when all that's happening.
I couldn't even imagine, especially because the other side is very obviously not even attempting to be peaceful. But I guess he was able to get such a big platform because he did stick to what his morals were, and he never really faltered from that. Even when he was put in jail, he would write his letters out and try to get his message out in the same exact way that he was when he was free and after he got out. It was always the same, and I think people really valued that consistency, and that he wasn't letting how the people that were fighting against them, how they were fighting and how they were fighting dirty, he didn't let that affect the way he wanted to fight for his rights.
And I suppose it's fair to say, maybe, or one could definitely argue that it was working, because the Civil Rights Act was imminent when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and then it was signed into law by LBJ. So that effort, would you say, or would you say it was a combination of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X in his aggression, or more so the time called for it? What do you think led to the Civil Rights Act finally being passed?
Wow, that's a hard question. I personally am of the belief that it is both of them. I think seeing both sides of really just like desperation to be treated equally kind of woke people up. I feel like if it would have just been one or the other, it would have been really hard to kind of get that perspective. But, I mean, yeah, the Civil Rights Act, the big one, the Voting Rights Act, was signed in 1965. So that was exactly 100 years after slavery had ended. And it took them 100 years of fighting violently and fighting non-violently and being killed and targeted to get the right to vote in the same way that white people did in the States. And that was specifically only saying that you couldn't bar someone from voting. That's all it was.
So when that's for the Voting Act, when do you think, so mentioning the southern states earlier on, the Jim Crow laws that they became known as. So Jim Crow was a character on radio?
I believe so, yeah. Who
sort of mocked or was a caricature of black people. So these laws that were basically, so you had to get off the pavement if a white person was coming, you couldn't look them in the eyes, drinking fountains for black people and for white people only, and buses segregated. All these segregated things are what we'd call Jim Crow laws.
Yeah.
When did that stop? Was that the Civil Rights Act, or had that sort of stopped before?
That would have been, I guess, officially stopped in the 60s. So like 64, 65 is really when it stopped officially. But even after that, there was still so much pent-up aggression in the South, because the people that had been in the KKK, they didn't stop being in the KKK when the Voting Rights Act was passed. It almost was just more fuel and more fire. The KKK continued into the 70s, 80s. I don't know how it went into the 90s, but I don't know if there's a great movie called Black Klansman that actually is based on a true story of a black police officer infiltrating the KKK. And it's incredible, and it really shows just how even after all those major laws and all that fighting was done, there was still so much hatred in the South.
Okay. So, all right, the 60s is an important for all sorts of reasons, I think, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. So in the 60s, you got the assassination of Kennedy, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the Vietnam War is going really badly, but also the introduction, I think, of, that's the right word, so more and more people have got televisions. Mm-hmm. So they're starting to see all of these horrific things in Birmingham, Alabama with the dogs. They're hearing about it, and also the televisions around the world maybe arguably has brought more international recognition of what was happening in America, particularly as well maybe thinking America needs to sort of have a bit of a look at itself in the 60s, this sort of reflection decade. And obviously the Cold War is at its peak as well. The world nearly ended in 1962 with Cuba. So all this going on, do you think that has contributed to why the 60s perhaps is the turning point?
I think so, definitely. I think if it wouldn't have had that larger platform, it would have continued well into the future. Because the big thing that really, I guess, got the South to finally change in that way was the pressure from the other people around them. So it was the pressure from northern states when they were seeing, for example, I'm pretty sure they actually like printed or broadcasted the Emmett Till pictures.
Yeah, so Mum absolutely wanted the photograph of little Emmett Till
exactly
in the coffin.
So that was finally when people started being like, what is happening there? What are you guys doing? You were very obviously doing something wrong. So I guess it really is, media is to thank, because if the South would have been kind of left in its own echo chamber, I couldn't even say that it wouldn't be the same way it is today that it was back then.
Okay. So let's skip forward then a little bit to more modern times, and arguably the biggest indicator that we are in a different world and everything is so much better now is Barack Obama. Mm-hmm. So we've got our first black president elected, chosen by the people of America. That really is a statement, isn't it, that America is moving in the right direction at least?
I would love to say that, but having been, so the first election I was able to vote in was the one directly, so it was Biden versus Trump, so the one directly after the Hillary Trump one. But there was so much hatred for Obama after he left. There was almost like especially in the South, especially being from a more rural area in the South, a never again kind of rhetoric going around from a lot of people. The thing is, we have the Electoral College in the States, so not everybody's vote is just going to count one for one. So the reason why Barack Obama, a lot of people in the South thought, was able to win is because people in urban areas voted for him. And they thought that wasn't fair. So these people that had been basically arguing for years and years and years that the government was perfectly right and that the Electoral College was incredible and that it gave voices to people in the rural areas, the minute that people in urban areas were able to get somebody that was fighting for them into office, that's when people that didn't really appreciate that kind of person in office started basically saying that the Electoral College needs to be abolished. So I guess you can, at least in the South, it really felt like you could never win, which is upsetting. But even, going from the college I went to back home, I would go through back roads and there would be Confederate flags flying, which is the flag of the South in the Civil War, which is hundreds of years ago at this point.
So that's a symbol of racism, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. Some people would argue it isn't, but, Yeah.
So I think if you're going to see Confederate flags, you might often see Nazi flags as well in people's gardens and front yards and things.
I never did, but
But the Confederate flag definitely.
right, absolutely. There's an argument in the South about how flying the Confederate flag is a show of heritage because that's where we're from, but not hate. But the thing is that the Southern states were never actually recognized as a country, so there's no heritage there.
Right. Okay. So that sort of leads nicely onto this idea about statues. And there's been a big fuss in America, and there's been a big fuss here about statues. Slave traders in this country, they, with their wealth, philanthropists, if you like, they built schools, they built hospitals, so they have statues named after them and hospitals named after them and streets named after them. Is that similar in America?
Absolutely. In the South, the biggest thing is all these major Confederate generals, so people that were actively fighting for slavery to stay a thing in the States, have monuments erected for them and have streets named after them. I think the street next to my high school was named Robert E. Lee Boulevard, which is a major Confederate general. And it's caused a lot of backlash because it's like, why are we memorializing these people and not other people that actually fought to be on the right side of history, really?
So controversial then. So I would imagine, like it was here when people tore down statues, that it really got people arguing and it really polarized the situation. So in America, obviously, there are going to be people, I suppose, in the Deep South who want these statues of their heroes. So Robert Lee, as a Confederate general, they want their hero. And then you've got people not of a similar mind, want it all removed. And I think, I remember that one of the bishops, I think, Al Sharpton maybe, or somebody quite notorious in America for the right reasons, a famous figure saying that no, these statues must remain so that history doesn't forget. What do you think about that?
I disagree, honestly.
So this is an African American saying, no, they have to stay because it's a reminder.
I think the thing is we will remember Robert E. Lee because we learn about him. It's in our curriculum. He doesn't need 50 statues across the state of Georgia because there's a difference between, that's not remembering him, that's basically making him a hero. Because we don't have statues of people like Emmett Till. We don't have statues of people like Harriet Tubman. You don't see statues like that. Why? We remember them still. We talk about them all the time. They're super important to our history. So the idea that they need to stay up to remember it's kind of a farce because that's what education is for. That's what learning about it is for. We don't need the statue to see him. Very
fair point. And it's quite upsetting to think that there isn't anything for Harriet Tubman. I mean, there must be, surely, somewhere. We might have a look at this after this podcast. Is there anything, a school, a library or something, because she was quite an incredible woman. And again, in St. Clement's, we do study Harriet Tubman and her impact. So, all right, well, we'll draw this to a bit of a close shortly. But just to think about how the journey has gone from, we started us off with the Civil War, and today, one of the big sort of landmark events probably of the last few years related to race relations would be the George Floyd incident. And there's a general consensus, perhaps, or feeling outside of America that there is still some, police targeting young black teenagers. Racial profiling and things like that. Is that something that you feel within America, or is that what it looks like from the outside?
I think as somebody that was younger in America, it was something that a lot of people in my age group held very closely because that was, for us, such a defining moment. I actually specifically remember going to protests in my town for like the Black Lives Matter events and stuff because it was happening all around me and it was happening. I had friends that were directly affected. So it's hard to say for everybody, but at least for me and the people I was around and the people I went to college with and grew up with, it does feel like something that is still ongoing and still needs a lot of attention. Whereas with some of the older generations in the area, it kind of feels like there's some sweeping under the rug going on, which is upsetting because it's such an easy thing to fix if people are just looking in the right places to fix it.
I suppose your leadership of recent years, by that I mean, and this is not to be political, I have an opinion, but America is very polarised right now, isn't it?
Absolutely.
What that means is you are either one or the other, so you are either red or blue, Democrat or Republican, Trump or not. And that sort of takes out the large middle, doesn't it, of the US? So it seems, from what we can see from the outside, that the polarised nature of your country at the moment is so volatile, so toxic, so aggressive that we're never going to get this progress, are we, until we can find a balance ground. Do you feel it in your, like, coming from America, you've only been here now a couple of months, do you feel that toxicity, that red or blue?
Absolutely. I feel like, as someone that like is very big into political science, the last thing we were actually able to really agree on was an education bill in like 2004. So before any of this even really happened, and ever since then, it's just been spreading farther and farther and farther apart, because obviously with COVID and, like you said, the very contentious political landscape and the Black Lives Matter movement and everything that is happening currently that is creating the history, people just can't seem to find a middle ground on it. And sometimes it feels that people don't want to. A lot of people want to stay in their own group and not really, I guess, learn and accept that there are going to be different points of view. And that is what is causing that big divide, because nobody wants to take that step into the middle and accept that there might be rights and wrongs on both sides. And it's hard to watch.
Yeah. What's sad about listening to what you're saying is, and it's such an amazing insight, so thank you so much, is that we're talking about the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, this horrific black period of history, and here we are now in the 2020s, and race relations are still at the top of the agenda, are still there, and they're still happening, and maybe, possibly, even arguably worse in a modern world that's supposed to be open-minded and far more educated. And at least back then, people weren't educated. You had your ignorant people from the older days, those people who were born in the 1800s. But it's crazy for me to think that we're still in this position, 2023, and we still haven't quite moved on.
I think the hard thing for me is, being a numbers person, seeing how we went from 1865, the end of slavery, to 1965, the big Civil Rights Act happening. And we're nearing closer, I know it's 40 years in the future, but we're nearing closer to 2065. And I think the big question is, where are we going to be there? Are we going to have stepped backwards? Are we going to have finally been able to take those steps forward? But it's coming, I think, a lot faster than people are expecting. And I guess I just am excited to see what happens and how I can contribute to the change happening.
Yeah, and you certainly will be. So, Miss Owings, thank you so much for today.
Of course.
This is really, really interesting, and obviously we do study this, and you will be teaching this at the end of the year. So I think the students are going to get a really valuable insight to our topic from you, particularly from Georgia, which is one of the southern states that perhaps gets a little bit of attention.
Yeah.
Which will be really, really quite interesting. So thank you so much again for your time, and maybe we'll have another episode of American history somewhere else down the line.
Amazing. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Take care. Okay, everybody. Thank you once again for joining us. Hopefully you enjoyed that really interesting insight from Miss Owings. We will be with you very shortly for our next episode of ModsPod. Take care, everybody, and goodbye.